Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping straight into a really big one. Gun rights versus gun control in America. It's incredibly complex.
Absolutely. And we've pulled together quite a range of sources to try and, make sense of it all.
Yeah, we've got material from the YIP Institute, the NRA's Institute for Legislative Action. That's their lobbying arm.
Right.
Everytown Research and Policy, the American Academy of Family Physicians, Wikipedia for some background, and of course, the Second Amendment itself.
And our mission here really is to give you, the listener, a clearer view of all the different facets. We're talking history, legal battles, public health data, public opinion.
Without getting totally overwhelmed, hopefully.
Exactly. We want to unpack it piece by piece.
So we'll be looking at policy papers, court decisions, health statistics, historical texts, opinion polls, a real mix.
Okay, so where do we start? The foundation.
Let's do it. The Second Amendment.
Okay, so understanding the Second Amendment, you really have to look back. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 is a key influence. Well, it tackled the issue of the monarchy disarming people, Protestants specifically back then, and the Supreme Court, in the Heller decision back in 2008.
A landmark case we'll definitely get into more.
Right. They pointed to this English right, saying it was seen as an individual right at the time, not just about militias, a right against the crown taking away your arms.
So that idea of an individual right wasn't just invented recently. It has historical roots.
It does, and Heller really leaned on that historical interpretation, kind of shifting the focus away from it only being about militias.
But then you hit that first phrase, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. That sounds pretty collective, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and that's, the core of the debate in many ways. How does that militia part connect to the individual right part?
Different interpretations, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. Some people pointing to the dissenting opinions in Heller, or even early American commentators like the Federal Farmer or Alexander Hamilton. They argue the right is fundamentally tied to serving in a militia. The main goal, in their view, was making sure states could have their own forces, kind of a check on federal power.
And we see that emphasis on the collective, the state security aspect in some of the early state constitutions too, right? Like New York, Vermont, Massachusetts.
Precisely. Those early state documents often link bearing arms directly to the common defense, the security of the state. That reflects the thinking at the time.
Okay.
And you also have the history of militia laws in Britain influencing how Americans thought about, civic duty and having arms for the common good.
Now, here's a really interesting bit we found. During the debates about ratifying the Constitution, Robert Whitehill proposed adding an explicit right to hunt.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
What does that tell us?
Well, it suggests that for some people, at least, the reason for having guns wasn't only about militia service. It hints at broader purposes like hunting, maybe even self-defense in a more general sense.
Raises questions about what the framers really intended, or maybe the intentions were diverse.
Could be. It complicates a simple militia-only reading, for sure.
And then there's the difficult but really important argument connecting the Second Amendment's push to slavery, particularly the role of slave patrols in the South.
Yes, that's a critical perspective. Historians like Paul Finkelman argue that the need for armed patrols to, control enslaved people was a significant factor for some Southern states wanting the Second Amendment.
So these patrols were essentially armed groups of white men enforcing slavery.
That's the argument, that the amendment helped ensure they could remain armed for that purpose. It's a really sobering historical lens.
Definitely adds another complex layer.
Yeah.
And looking at how the amendment was actually drafted, there were changes, weren't there? Things taken out.
There were. Notably, a specific definition of what the militia was got removed during Senate revisions, and so did a clause about conscientious objectors.
Interesting. What might that imply?
Well, taking those out could suggest they were broadening the scope, maybe moving away slightly from just military stuff. It kind of lends more weight to the individual rights interpretation that the Supreme Court eventually adopted in Heller.
Okay, so that sets the historical stage with all its complexities.
Yeah.
Let's move to the legal arena. District of Columbia v. Heller, 2008. You said it was pivotal.
Absolutely pivotal. The Supreme Court basically said, yes, the Second Amendment protects an individual's right to have firearms for traditionally lawful purposes.
Like self-defense in the home.
Exactly. Self-defense in the home was the core issue in Heller. It was a major shift away from interpretations that focused only on the militia connection.
And that wasn't the end of the story in the courts, was it? McDonald v. Chicago followed soon after.
Right, just 2 years later, 2010. McDonald was crucial because it said the Second Amendment right applies to state and local governments too, not just the federal government.
How did it do that?
Through the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, it's a process called incorporation. So, Heller set the individual rights standard at the federal level, and McDonald made it apply nationwide.
Got it. But even in Heller, it wasn't unanimous. There were strong disagreements, like
Yeah.
from Justice Stevens.
Yes, Justice Stevens wrote a powerful dissent. He argued the amendment was primarily about protecting the state's ability to maintain militias.
Not so much about individual gun ownership for other purposes.
Right. He believed the majority went too far in reading a broad common law right of self-defense into the Second Amendment, and that it didn't really limit the government's power to regulate civilian gun use significantly. He focused heavily on that opening militia clause.
So, since Heller and McDonald, the lower courts have been busy, right?
Mm.
Testing the boundaries.
Constantly. You see challenges to all sorts of gun laws, restrictions on carrying concealed weapons, bans on certain types of firearms.
Like assault weapons.
Exactly. The courts have to figure out how Heller's principles apply to specific regulations. It's led to a real patchwork of decisions. Some laws get upheld as reasonable limits, others get struck down. It's very much an ongoing legal evolution.
And there was another Supreme Court case, Voisin v. United States in 2016, something about domestic violence.
Yes, Voisin. That case dealt with the Lautenberg Amendment, a federal law that stops people convicted of domestic violence misdemeanors from owning guns.
Okay.
The question was whether a conviction based on reckless conduct, not necessarily intentional conduct, still counted. The court said yes, it does. If you recklessly cause injury in a domestic situation, that conviction can still bar you from gun ownership under federal law.
That seems like an important clarification.
It was. It potentially broadened the reach of that specific prohibition.
And it's not just about who can own guns, but the process, too. We see challenges to things like waiting periods, like California's 10-day wait.
Right. The argument there is usually that waiting periods put an undue burden on the Second Amendment right.
Especially for self-defense, they argue. If someone feels they need a gun right away.
That's the core of the claim, that it delays the ability to exercise the right when it might be needed most.
Okay, shifting to more recent things.
Yeah.
We've seen proposed federal legislation, like Senator Schiff's assault weapons ban of 2025, and state laws like Illinois' SB 26502, trying to ban semi-automatics like AR-15s and Glocks.
Yeah, these are definitely major flashpoints now. They get right to the heart of the disagreement over what kinds of firearms are protected by the Second Amendment.
What are the main arguments on each side there?
Well, proponents of bans say these are weapons designed for military combat, with features like high-capacity magazines, making them unsuitable for civilian self-defense and disproportionately dangerous in mass shootings.
And the opponents?
Opponents argue these are very common firearms, owned by millions of law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes, including self-defense, sport shooting, collecting. They say banning them infringes on the core Second Amendment right established in Heller.
And we saw Justice Thomas, in a dissent, specifically argue against these kinds of categorical bans on commonly owned firearms, right? He mentioned AR-style rifles being common.
Exactly. He cited Heller and McDonald, and even an earlier case, Staples v. United States, which acknowledged the commonality of certain rifles. His argument is essentially that if a firearm is in common use for lawful purposes, the Second Amendment protects it, and outright bans are unconstitutional under current precedent.
That seems like a direct challenge to the logic behind those proposed bans.
It is. It sets up a major constitutional conflict based on how the court has interpreted the Second Amendment so far.
Okay, let's pivot a bit. We looked at sources from the American Academy of Family Physicians, the AAFP. They frame gun violence as a public health epidemic. That's a different way of looking at it.
It really is. Framing it as a public health issue means approaching it like other health crises using data, research, and prevention strategies.
Focusing on reducing injury and death overall.
Precisely. It shifts the focus from just crime or rights to understanding risk factors, identifying vulnerable populations, and implementing evidence-based interventions to improve safety and well-being for everyone.
And the data they present, the comparison between the U.S. firearm homicide rate and other high-income countries is, well, stark.
It's incredibly stark. The U.S. rate is many, many times higher than countries like Canada, the UK, France, Italy. It highlights a unique situation here.
But the AAFP also emphasizes that gun violence isn't just about mass shootings, right?
That's a crucial point. Mass shootings get the headlines, but they are, statistically, a smaller part of the overall picture.
What are the bigger parts?
Suicide is a huge one. More than half of all suicides in the U.S. involve a firearm. It's often the most lethal method.
Wow.
And intimate partner violence. Firearms are used in almost two-thirds of homicides involving intimate partners.
That's devastating.
And perhaps the most shocking statistic recently, in 2020, firearms became the leading cause of death for children and adolescents in the U.S.
The leading cause, ahead of car accidents.
Ahead of car accidents, ahead of cancer. It's a statistic that really stops you in your tracks.
It absolutely does. It forces you to see the issue affects families and communities in ways that go far beyond those high-profile tragedies.
It is pervasive.
Now, there was this thing called the Dickey Amendment. It had a big impact on gun violence research for a long time.
Yes, the Dickey Amendment, passed back in '96. It had language that essentially stopped the CDC from funding research that could be seen as promoting gun control.
So it basically froze research.
It had a significant chilling effect for years. Researchers were wary, funding dried up for certain types of studies, but more recently, Congress has clarified the language and actually appropriated funds specifically for the CDC and NIH to study gun violence. The key stipulation now is that the funding can't be used to advocate for specific policies, but the research itself is now encouraged.
So the door is open again for more federally funded research.
Yes, which the AAFP strongly supports. They argue we desperately need more data.
And better data collection systems, too.
Absolutely. They point to systems like the National Violent Death Reporting System, NVDRS, as valuable. It collects detailed info on violent deaths.
But there are gaps.
A major gap they highlight is tracking non-fatal firearm injuries. We don't have a good national system for that, which means we don't fully understand the true burden of gun violence, the long-term disabilities, the healthcare costs, the trauma.
So the public health approach is really about understanding the whole picture through data and then finding ways to prevent the harm.
Exactly. Data-driven, evidence-based prevention.
Okay, so what kinds of prevention does the AAFP suggest based on that approach? Let's take suicide first, since it's such a large component.
For suicide prevention, they emphasize things like better access to mental health care, routine screening for suicide risk by doctors, but also specific firearm safety measures. There's growing evidence suggesting things like waiting periods for gun purchases.
Giving a cooling off period?
Potentially, yes. Also, minimum age laws for buying guns, safe storage laws requiring guns to be locked up, universal background checks, and maybe even looking at restrictions on openly carrying firearms in some public places.
Okay. What about preventing homicides and other violent crime involving guns?
The evidence there is maybe a bit more mixed, but strategies they highlight include things like hot spotting or focused deterrence policing, concentrating resources in high crime areas.
Right.
Also, community-based violence intervention programs, which often work to mediate conflicts and sometimes remove illegal guns from circulation. And again, universal background checks are seen as potentially impactful by making it harder for prohibited people to get guns in the first place.
And then mass shootings. Even though they're statistically rarer, they have a huge impact. Any prevention strategies mentioned there?
The AAFP points to research suggesting that state bans on high-capacity magazines might reduce the number and severity of mass shooting incidents.
Magazines that hold a lot of rounds.
Correct. They also mention the 1994 federal assault weapons ban. During the 10 years it was in effect, some studies suggest there was a decrease in deaths from what they term gun massacres compared to before and after.
Interesting. Okay, last category. Unintentional shootings, accidental deaths, and injuries, especially involving kids.
Here, the focus is overwhelmingly on safe storage.
Locking guns up.
Locking them up, unloading them, storing ammunition separately. They stress the importance of doctors talking to patients about safe storage, public awareness campaigns, and also child access prevention laws, HAIP laws.
What do those do?
They hold adults legally accountable if a child gets access to their unsecured firearm and causes harm. The idea is to create a stronger incentive for safe storage.
So this public health perspective offers a whole different set of tools and ways of thinking about prevention.
Definitely. It complements the legal and rights-based discussions.
Let's shift now to public opinion. What do people actually think? We know opinions can shift, especially after major events.
They really can. Back in the 90s, sometimes the concern was more about crime itself, maybe less focus on gun control specifically. But we've seen definite spikes in support for stricter gun laws after major shootings. Aurora, Sandy Hook,
Parkland?
Parkland, Buffalo, Uvalde at Robb Elementary. These tragedies often lead to a noticeable jump in polls showing people want more regulation.
Are there specific measures that consistently get high public support?
Yes, several. Universal background checks requiring checks for all gun sales, including private ones and at gun shows, consistently polls extremely high, often 80–90% support.
That's broad agreement.
Very broad. Other measures with majority support usually include creating a national gun sale database, banning assault weapons, though support levels vary more on that one, and safe storage requirements.
And we saw this across different polls, right? Gallup, ABC News Ipsos. Even Fox News polls showed strong support for certain restrictions.
That's right. An ABC Ipsos poll in June 2022, for example, found a clear majority prioritizing new gun control laws over protecting gun ownership rights. And Fox News polls in 2019 and 2023 showed high support, often over 80 or even 90%, for things like universal background checks, red flag laws, and raising the minimum age to 21 for more types of firearms.
Suggests some common ground exists, at least on specific proposals.
It does seem that way, even if the overall political debate remains highly polarized. You also see public sentiment expressed in things like the Enough National School Walkout in 2018 after Parkland. That was a powerful demonstration, especially by young people.
We also saw data on gun ownership itself. Gallup in 2020 found a pretty significant chunk of Americans either own a gun or live with someone who does.
Yes, ownership is widespread. And some social science research links attitudes about guns and gun control to broader cultural values, like individualism versus collectivism in different parts of the country. It's deeply tied into culture.
Okay, we absolutely need to cover the arguments against more gun control. The NRA's Institute for Legislative Action, the NRA-ILA, has a very clear stance.
They do. Their core argument is essentially that gun control laws don't stop criminals because criminals, by definition, don't follow laws.
So restricting guns mainly affects law-abiding citizens.
That's their position. They argue the focus should be on crime control specifically, enforcing existing laws against people who use guns illegally. They believe that's the effective way to reduce violence, not adding new restrictions on gun ownership for everyone.
They sometimes point to specific programs as examples, right? Like Project Exile.
Yes, they often cite initiatives like Project Exile in Richmond, Virginia, years ago, which involved strict federal prosecution for felons caught with guns. They see that kind of targeted enforcement against actual gun criminals as the real solution.
And the underlying principle is protecting the Second Amendment rights of responsible gun owners from what they see as unnecessary burdens.
Exactly. Don't punish the law-abiding for the actions of criminals. Focus on the criminals. That's the crux of their argument.
Makes sense as a clear counterpoint. Finally, let's just touch on how much things vary state by state. It's not one size fits all in the U.S.
Not at all. The state-level landscape is incredibly varied. You mentioned California's waiting period earlier. That's one example.
Right.
Other states might have very different rules on who can carry a gun where, what types of guns are restricted, or the process for buying one. We saw some notes suggesting New York and Massachusetts might not have specific laws allowing police to deny gun permits just based on general public safety concerns. But honestly, the details get very specific, and state laws change, so confirming that precisely would take more digging into their current statutes.
Yeah, those specific points seemed a bit unclear in the source snippets we had.
They did. And things like qualified immunity for police or state funding for violence intervention programs, again, it varies. Our notes suggested New York and Massachusetts don't limit qualified immunity but do fund intervention programs.
But again, need to be cautious about the specifics without a deeper dive into each state's current laws.
Exactly. But the main takeaway is states are trying different things, reflecting those ongoing debates about balancing rights and safety within their own borders.
Okay, so wrapping this up, it's clear this gun rights versus gun control debate is, well, deeply complex.
Incredibly complex. You've got the history, the evolving legal interpretations, the stark public health realities, shifting public opinion, and these fundamentally opposing arguments about rights and safety.
And the sources we looked at today really show that range of perspectives.
They do. From the constitutional arguments in Heller, to the AAFP's public health data, to the NRA-ILA's focus on crime control, to the polls reflecting what people think, It covers a lot of ground.
It really does. We've tried to give you a sense of those different dimensions.
It's a landscape with deep disagreements and often seemingly irreconcilable views.
So, for our final thought, something for you, the listener, to think about. After hearing all this, the history, the court cases, the health stats, the different arguments, what single part of this whole debate do you find most compelling? Or maybe the part that feels like it needs the most attention right now? And maybe reflect on why finding any common ground seems so incredibly difficult on this issue in America today.